Hello, I'm going to welcome everybody and happy to see so many people have joined us. And I realize we're starting and people will continue to join us. Hello, and my name is Sujatha Ramanujan. I'm on the board of directors at the National Women's Hall of Fame. We are the oldest museum and center dedicated to the history and the achievements of American women. We've been in place for over 50 years in the home and the birthplace of the American women's right to vote, Seneca Falls, New York. And today, as part of our alternate month forum, we have the honor and privilege of welcoming Dr. Deborah Turner, the president of the League of Women Voters. Dr. Turner, who is an MD and a JD, serves as the 20th president of the League of Women Voters of the United States and chair of the Board of Trustees of the League of Women Voters Education Fund. Elected by board president at the 54th National Convention of the League of Women Voters in June of 2020 and will serve in this position until June of 2022. Turner was elected to the League's National Board of Directors in 2006, where she served as finance on the governance committee and chaired the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. As the chair of the DEI committee, Deborah and her colleagues focused on organizational culture changes to the League's mission work, emphasizing not only racial equity, but also intergenerational dynamics, socioeconomic differences, gender identity, and interpersonal engagement. Dr. Turner has an illustrious career as a gynecological oncologist and is internationally recognized. She's an inductee of the Iowa Women's Hall of Fame, and it is our pleasure to welcome here today. Welcome, Dr. Turner.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be with you, and I'm looking forward to an exciting and fun evening.
Great. This is a really momentous year. It is a presidential election year, and it is the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which gave some, but not all women, the right to vote. So we're excited to be celebrating that anniversary and looking at what the impending election brings us. So with that, I'd like to take a moment to discuss the League and its mission. The League of Women Voters has a long and intertwined history with voting rights. Dating from before the 19th Amendment was passed. Would you like to take a moment to tell us a little bit about the League and its mission, and also how you got involved with the League of Women Voters?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Sujatha. The mission is simple: empowering voters and defending democracy, but the work is multidimensional. The League of Women Voters was actually founded in 1920 by American suffrage leaders, just 6 months before the 19th Amendment was ratified. The organization was created to support the millions of newly enfranchised women to play a role in voting and democracy. And over the last century, our nonpartisan organization has grown our grassroots in all 50 states, including Hong Kong and also Puerto Rico, with more than 750 chapters around the country. Main role of the League is demanding a fair and impartial and complete access to voting. We want to eliminate all forms of voter disenfranchisement or suppression, and we want to guarantee and increase access, make voting easier, eliminate racial and political gerrymandering, and assure that communities of color and communities with less financial resources have the same access to the ballot. However, voting is not what we are all about. We partner with groups around diversity, equity, and inclusion, racial justice, climate change, healthcare, clean water, money in politics, and many other topics that touch different leagues in their local areas. We are working hard to move the dial on all of these topics. We do this activity by person-to-person work, voter education forums and debates, and advocacy at both the local and the national level. So there's a place for everybody to be engaged with the League, no matter what your interest is. If you're interested in democracy and you're interested in the fact that women have the power to form a more perfect democracy, including men. We have many men members also. I just want you to know that we are happy to have you.
Well, we're excited to have you here with us. Can you tell me a little bit about what made you join the League of Women Voters, when you joined, and a little bit about what drove you?
Right. Well, it's very interesting. I joined the League like many people who are League members have joined. I had a friend who invited me to an educational program that the League of Women Voters in my local town, I was living in Des Moines, Iowa at that time, and they were doing a program on, at that time, sex trafficking. So I went to the program. It was very informative. It was well received. It was just a great event. And afterwards, I went home and I pulled up the League of Women Voters site on my computer. And those were a few years ago. My computer wasn't great, but I could figure out how to do it. That's one thing. Okay. And I looked at the list of topics and areas that the League was doing the work in. And I was like, I have finally found the organization that really speaks to my heart. And so I called my friend up and said, yeah, I'm ready to join the League. And since that time, I've been engaged in the League from day one, spent time sitting on their board, became president of the local league, then the state league, and eventually became a member of the national board. Basically, quite frankly, since that very first day when I went to my first League Up event, League has become my endorphin in life. So.
Excellent. And we are so happy you did this because the change you've made is actually outstanding. I'd like to take a moment before we launch into some of our discussion topics to let our audience know both Dr. Turner and I belong to organizations that are 501c3 not-for-profit, which means that this discussion is a nonpartisan discussion. It is about voter access. We do not advocate or suggest any particular candidate or party. And as we open up to questions later, we will have to make sure that the questions also follow suit. So the format that we're going to use is we have a set of selected topics, which we will cover over the next 30 or so minutes. And then we'll open the floor to any questions that you might have. I've also received questions via emails. We'll be addressing some of those and perhaps some of the topics we haven't gotten through. But we're excited about the discussion. We do let you know that we will remain nonpartisan throughout this discussion. So the first topic we wanted to talk about were the statistics around the influence of women. Now, according to the Washington Post, in every election since 1964, more women have voted than men. And I think it's a number like 10 million. Would you like to comment on some of the issues that separate women and men and what drives women to the polls and our turnout rate?
Okay, sure. First of all, just specifically looking at some data, I think that is really impressive. If you look at the data from the Center for American Progress, it shows that in 2018, the turnout among women in voting surged 15 points compared to 2014, both midterm years. And since 2000, citizenship voting age population of women of color has increased by 59%, a gain of 13.5 million potential voters. For non-Hispanic white women, it increased by 8%. So what are the issues that are driving women to the polls? And it's very clear, as we know, women tend to be mission driven. If you understand what that means, that there are issues that really compel them to work and do the things they do, to engage in the activities in their life, both around themselves, around their work, and around their families in particular. So if you look across the board, the issues that most drive women to the polls are very clear. You look at all groups of women, Black, Latinx, Asian, Hispanic, Pacific Asian, I apologize here, I'm losing my voice, and Native American. The issues that are really pushing women, number one in almost every group is healthcare. Healthcare for themselves, healthcare for their family, healthcare for the nation. The other top issues are immigration, the economy, and gun policy. And it's interesting, the women's look at economy is not about necessarily what, the economy of the country in the sense of what may be the overall economy of the country. It's about the economy for their community, for their family, for their schools, and economy really relates to healthcare. So those are the issues that push women to the polls. And interestingly enough, the other reason I think we see a surge in women voting is that women truly believe that their vote counts. And they have a belief in the system that if they vote, they can push the dial on those issues that are important to them. So those are kind of the things that bring women to the polls with passion.
So while we've seen a really good, significant increase in the turnout in women voters, in general, voter is not as high as we'd like it. Are there some specific issues about voter access that relate to women that we need to look at, especially as we look at childcare and pandemic? If you had some comments on that.
Sure. It's really, and it's a very interesting thing. If you look at access to voting, in many ways, it kind of centers around economy in the sense of that we like to think of voting as a free activity. You're not supposed to have to pay to vote. However, in order to vote, there's a cost to vote. So if you are a caretaker or you have a job that you have difficulty getting away from and you maybe can't afford that time, that's a cost to vote. How far do you have to go to access your poll? It's interesting. I was talking to a few people, women the other day, and it's like, if their polling site is a distance from their home, and then their working site is a distance from their polling site, they have to manage to get to their polling site, then get to the work and get home. So those are costs in time, maybe not direct money, although it can be, and in time. So what we see is as polling sites become less and less, and COVID has decreased the number of polling sites, and we've used COVID in some way to decrease polling sites in ways that maybe we shouldn't have. It makes it more difficult for women to vote. Also, the need to say, take your children to vote with you. Do you have someone to watch your children while you are voting? Or can you take them? Is that an easy thing to do? Do you have someone else in your family that you're caring for? There are so many things that impact women that way. And then just the rules around voting this year have become so complex. The time it takes to find out how you vote, how you register, how you vote, when you can vote, and those pieces have become also barriers to voting, particularly for women who may not have time to do that. So
Those are some really, and I'm wondering, when we look at the pandemic, a lot of people are at home and the unemployment rate, particularly high for women and women. And home also, I mean, a lot of, and I've been working from home, but for those of us with young children, working from home is a three-ring circus. It's insane, right? And I'm wondering whether the fact that people are at home is going to make it so you're home so you can get to the polling site more easily, or you really want to run away from your children so you go to the polling site more easily, or if it goes the other way, you're like, oh my goodness, now I'm trying to work from my desk at home. I've got my kids screaming over here, and I have to get to the polls, and it's I don't know what that's going to mean.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, as we've looked at, and I think we're going to talk a little bit later about some ways to access voting easier, but, even the thought of early voting and voting by mail I was on a similar panel a couple of weeks ago talking with some folks, I believe it was in Ohio, and they were talking about, well, you could do vote by mail, say, if you're at home and you have your children and you don't have time. And they said there are places in this country where there aren't even mailboxes relatively convenient for them to drop their ballot in if they need to drop their ballot. Or if you have a ballot that needs the stamp, it's figuring out how do you and where do you go to buy that single stamp if you don't need a book of stamps. So those are things that create barriers that some of us who have probably a little bit more luxury time or luxury in our life, so to speak, maybe don't think about as barriers to not only women voting, but to many folks voting.
Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to talk through some of these issues, and don't let me forget, but before this wraps up, we need to offer people a way to help. So if we can think of ways that people can help, we're going to get to those, and hopefully they'll go out in the email. The next question area I kind of wanted to explore here was minority participation. And the non-white voting population has played a large role in driving the growth of the nation's electorate. And from 2000 to 2018, its eligible voter population grew 43 million people. And voters who are Hispanic, Black, Asian, or other ethnicities account for 3/4 of the growth. And this came from Pew Research. At the same time, what we also are seeing is the voter turnout around minorities really lags by white voters. So we see about a 65% turnout among white voters, 60% among Black voters, 49% among Hispanic, and 47% around Asian. And I want to talk a little bit about, we're talking about making sure everyone has access and the ability to vote. What do you think some of these reasons might be, both from motivation as well as from access, that seems to affect minorities more significantly?
Well, a couple of things we just talked about, just the fact of where your polling site is or how you can get to your polling site is one piece. So both the access and transportation in the sense of where you can go and how you vote. getting the information about voting. How do you register? Where do you register? Where do you vote? That becomes more difficult many times for minority communities because they don't have, a lot of times the people who are reaching out to people to vote don't think about the fact that everybody needs to be educated about the voting system, not just get specific groups. And the other thing is that historically in our country, unfortunately, many times voters of color have not been sought out, until the last moment. I can remember several years ago when I was working in a campaign type setting, and one of the campaigners, who was a woman of color, an African American woman, said, the candidates and the parties, or whoever's voting for whatever issue it is, they need to come early and they need to come often. So many times, this is something that we don't talk about a lot, but many times we find that minority groups or groups of color are not reached out until the last moment, when all of a sudden it's felt that we may need your vote. And people vote because they find out, one, that there's an issue that's really driving them to vote, but also they vote because they feel like people want their vote and need their vote. And if somebody needs your vote, you're more likely to vote then, because at this point, and it's reached out to you to let you understand how important your vote is, you're going to more likely vote than not. So if we can get over all the other barriers, from transportation to sites of voting to how to get the information, and that, the next piece we really need to do is acknowledge that everybody's needs and everybody's issues are important, and our politicians need to start thinking about what are really the important issues for our, a given group of the electorate, and then address those issues, and not just with words, but with plans and with policies and the ideas, because those things will drive people to the polls.
Excellent. And I'm also, and it is not directly tied to minorities, this is across the board, but I'm wondering, what role economics plays in that. Because if we take a look, the college educated group tends to turn out a voter rate than people who do not have a college degree or people who do not have a high school degree. And interestingly, the statistics show that in those who don't have the highest level of education, the gap between men and women is much higher. That actually women, I should say more women vote. It's actually less men vote when they don't have the same level of education. And again, part of it is access, as we discussed. But I wonder how much of that has to do with empowerment and the feeling of influence in the election and value, to what you were saying, and how can we help increase voter turnout in general?
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think that issue of empowerment and interest in the election is really key. When we go back to looking at what the topics were that drive women to vote, healthcare, immigration, economy, the economy, gun safety or gun policy, and of course, women's right to determine their own bodily autonomy, which is obviously being one of the issues that's showing up higher and higher in the polls. Those are things that drive women to vote. And that's why more women do vote. So turning our interest toward those topics, and our politicians or our candidates recognizing that these are things that are driving people to polls. But not only that, let's talk about the things that drive people to polls. Let's do something about it. So if voters see that not only somebody is talking about it, but they're doing something about it, they're more likely to vote. And certainly if we can make it economically wise for them to vote, so it's not costing them to vote. We really have to look at what is the cost of voting to individuals.
So I think these are things that we as a community have a responsibility to help with. So I'm really excited to be able to discuss these things. I also want to talk about youth participation briefly here, and I'm really hopeful that we have some youth on here, and people who are maybe not ready to vote yet, but will be voting. You are the future, and also I know that we have offered the tape of this conversation as a download to educators who want to talk to their students about voting. And participation among youth, and by youth I'm specifically referring to the 18 to 24, a little bit older than that group, hovers somewhere around 20%. At the same time, for the first time, millennials that are voting age outnumber boomers of voting age. So they actually have the power to move this election, yet their turnout is so very, very low. And so their voices are not being heard, and it is really their future that's being determined. So what can we do to help our youth be educated and have access to the vote? And what are your thoughts about turning out the youth vote?
Well, I have a couple of thoughts I think about. First of all, it comes back also to the ease of voting and eliminating the confusion around voting. So if we can make information about voting more easily accessible to youth. So, you really never want to engage in an activity if you're not sure how to do it and where to do it. So there are a lot of youth who feel uncomfortable around voting because they don't have the information. So we have to make the information readily available. Know what the rules are, and you're going to feel more comfortable doing it. Okay. Voter suppression among students is very interesting that there are states that have strict voter ID laws where you can use your gun license to register to vote, but you can't use your school ID as your voter ID or as your voter ID. And that suppresses students because a lot of times that may be the only photo ID they have. There are many students that don't actually have driver's license or such. And, they can say that, well, this is because the school ID doesn't have an expiration date or a lack of signature. There are things that we put in the way of voting. So there are things we can do to push our states and our universities to make it easier for students to vote by just figuring out how to get good school IDs so they can use their IDs. Doesn't seem like a big thing, but it's a huge thing, and it's eliminating a lot of students from voting. But more importantly, we need to come down to issues. We need to talk about the issues, listen to the issues they're talking about, and make sure that we're making them priorities in our elections. If you don't feel like somebody's talking to the issues that are important to you and is raising them as important, you're less likely to vote. And we really see that in the youth vote a lot. I'm not going to vote because there's not a candidate who's really pushing my issues. So we need to be really very, very introspective about the issues that we're talking about. But we also have to help youth understand that you're not going to get the ideal candidate every time. Nobody's going to agree with you. But if you vote, you have the opportunity to put somebody in place who then you can hold their feet to the fire and say, I want you to deal with this. And if you don't vote, you lose that power. Also, I tell you a little story here real quick. I was on a talk just a few days ago with a professor from one of the universities in Wisconsin. And he said how the students were complaining about there were issues around parking around their university, and it was really struggled them to get to any kind of activity or whatever. And she said to him, well, who makes those decisions about the parking? And they said, well, the city does. And he said, well, who is the city made up? Well, the alderman. She says, okay, here's the deal. Why don't you talk to the alderman, figure out who's running for office, find somebody who agrees with what you feel or understands that this is an issue, vote, hopefully get them elected, and then maybe the parking rules will change. And that's what the students did. And so when you have an issue that's important to you, you can get it done. So you just have to remember that. But the only way that you can get your issue looked at is you have to vote people in. And a lot of votes in this country are decided by a very low number, not by thousands and thousands. Some votes are determined by hundreds or just 2 or 3 or 4. So every vote can count. And I think we have to impress that on our youth also.
On that topic, I mean, it's a little bit of a sideways thing. Everybody is on the presidential election, and they're like, does my vote really matter? And first of all, I would argue yes. But the second part of that is what role that voter turnout plays in local elections and the impact it has there, and how important is that? How do we communicate that?
Well, and that's very interesting because one of the things I like to talk with all voters about, particularly voters, is not only the down ballot positions, like, who's going to be on the school board, who's going to be on the county supervisors, who's going to be, your governor, who's going to be your mayor, who's going to be your alderman, but also a lot of states have ballot issues, and ballot issues tend to be won by very small numbers. And ballot issues really deal with a lot of things that our youth are interested in. They deal with things around climate change. They deal with things around healthcare. They deal with things around, city government. And the only way that you can have an impact on a ballot issue is also to vote. So I think that's the other thing, that we don't vote just to elect the president. Because remember, the president doesn't elect your mayor, doesn't elect your governor, doesn't elect your alderman, doesn't decide who's the chief of police in your community. It's the voters who make those decisions. And those are the votes that are on a ballot that you don't get a chance to have a voice in if you don't vote.
Excellent. So I'm going to move to a topic from going from local elections to the concept of, it's a census year, and census determines districting. And so we have this topic around districting, and there's a lot of this conversation around gerrymandering. And I'd like to take a moment to help our listeners understand what is meant by districting and how the census plays into that. And also what is gerrymandering for people who don't understand what that might mean, and why is it such a relevant hot topic?
Okay. Well, this is a fun one for me because it's one that the league is definitely engaged in now, and I'll mention that in a little bit. But so the results of the census are used to inform the redistricting process in order to draw the congressional district lines. How many representatives in Congress your state gets and how many electoral college votes your state gets are determined by the census. Now, the term gerrymandering was coined by a review of Massachusetts redistricting maps in 1812. At that time, the map was set by a man named Governor Gerry, where the shape of the district that was drawn literally looked like the shape of a salamander. And it was used in order to gain political advantage. So that's where the gerrymandering came from, Jerry Salamander put together, okay? Gerrymandering is actually the intentional manipulation of the redistricting process in the United States that has been used to increase the power of a political party at the expense of the voters. When our communities are gerrymandered, so the lines are drawn for political reasons, it is the politicians who choose their voters instead of the voters who choose their candidates. Unfortunately, in most states, these lines are drawn by partisan politicians, not nonpartisan independent redistricting commissions. So unfortunately, in June of 2019, the Supreme Court ruled that political redistricting, in other words, drawing lines that give you a political advantage, was not an appropriate decision to be determined at the Supreme Court level, and they threw it back to the states. Now, they said racial gerrymandering was illegal, so you cannot draw lines just to basically empower or disenfranchise any given group racially. However, it is really hard to uncouple racial and political gerrymandering, because if you think about how, unfortunately, in our communities, in our states, in our cities, how populations live and where they live, it is clear that a lot of the lines of racial difference also are political differences. And therefore, if politicians are drawing lines that are quote unquote only political, they many times are racial. So if you can prove that racial gerrymandering is happening, or if that political lines are drawn and appear to be racial in effect, then you can have a chance to influence gerrymandering in our country. Right now, the league is involved in something called people-powered fair maps. And this is actually the first time there's actually been a national effort across the whole country to impact gerrymandering in every state. And the goal is to try to get states to look at having independent groups for making their redistricting. We have this active in all 50 states. And we're hoping that each of you will look at that issue and get involved in the actual redistricting in your community, because it will make a difference. Because you think about it, who makes the decision about what your community gets? Funding for schools, for example, funding for healthcare, for example. This is determined, many of these things are determined at the congressional level. And if you are gerrymandered, so you have a political district, you may not get the results you want. And also come back to the fact that if everybody isn't voted in the census, then you lose that political power also. So census is very critical, and it's going to determine how your districts are drawn.
So fill out your census. I think that's the first message. I'm going to switch gears a little bit because one of the things I want to make an effort to get out there is the process of voting. And this year, it really has been truly crazy. We have a presidential election. We're facing this global pandemic. We've had a lot of changes in the voting regulations and systems. So there's a lot of confusion about how do I vote? When do I vote? How do I make sure my vote counts? And I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about, what are the resources, what are the steps of voting, and what are the resources available to people? Recognizing that voting differs state by state, the voting methodology and rules differ. And so I'd like to start with talking about registration, what it means to register to vote, and what are some of the differences that we know of, and where can people go to find out information for their state and how to register?
Okay.
Do you want to comment? That's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot. So, okay. Well, first of all, you cannot vote unless you're registered. It's as simple as that. And registering to vote is basically like registering your automobile in some ways. Okay. And in order to, every state has a little different process of registration, but currently 40 states in the United States in 40 states in the United States, you have the ability to register online. So that means that you can go to an online source, usually your Secretary of State eventually, and you can register to vote. So you can become a registered voter. So that's the first step in voting completely. It's one of the fascinating things that I find when we do registration. The league does registration voting at nationalization ceremonies. And one of the most exciting things that I see is people coming out from their naturalization ceremony, and they're so excited and they are all pumped up to get registered to vote. So I'm just going like, I wish we could all feel like that in this country. It'd be awesome. Okay. But anyway, so you have to register first, and every state is different. And when we talk about some of the other things around voting, I just want to put out there now, and you'll probably hear this say it's over and over again, you need to go to the source. One of the best sources out there is vote411.org. And vote411.org is a one-stop shop for voters. It's run by the league, and you can find all the information you need. Voters can confirm if they're registered. If you aren't registered, there's information to tell you how do you register in your state. It checks all the information about voting that includes when and where to vote. If there are options for early voting or requesting absentee ballots, which we may talk about in a little bit. And also, along with the Vote for One voter access pieces are the candidate guides, so that we ask all the candidates for all the issues across at least the federal ones, and then local leagues put in also their local ones. And we ask them some very specific questions. They put their own answers in. We do not alter them. We do not touch them. We print them as they say, so that you can look at your voters. You can see what candidates, see what their issues are, where they stand on issues, and you can compare their answers to, what you feel is, where your values are or what you want in a candidate. So it's a great place to get all the information you need, but it starts out with register to vote.
Excellent. So that's vote411.org. You will be getting that link in an email following this presentation to all people who registered for this event. You'll also see it on our website. And if you go to the League of Women Voters website, vote411.org. So talk a little bit about the registration deadline. So part of the reason we picked this date, we'd actually picked a date that was a week out. And then I looked at when the New York State voter registration deadline was coming up. And I'm like, oh, no, we need to have this informational session before the deadline to register to vote. So that deadline is very, very soon. So for people who are watching this, it's October 1st. You only have a couple days. It's online. You could just hop online and do it. I helped my daughter do it for the first time. She turned 18 last year, first election. So we hopped online and registered her. 40 of the states you can do that, but do it now or you will not be voting in November. So the next part is, so you've registered, and not, fear. It's a pandemic and people are wondering about the different methods of voting. So I want to talk through the different methods, which is mail-in, meaning absentee or otherwise, early voting, day of voting, and how that happens. So let's start with the mailing ballots. And there's been so much information, misinformation, crazy going on there on the concept of the mail-in ballot. So I'd like to break it down a little bit in terms of absentee ballots, and who can, what qualifies as an absentee ballot, and does everyone get to mail in? So, or do you have to have reasons? This might be a good time to talk about what it means to mail in your vote.
Right. And so once again, we're going to confuse you. There is no specific answer to who all gets to do it because every state has different rules around mail-in balloting. There are 2 states in the country where everybody gets sent. And actually, it's going to probably be 3, maybe by the end of, depending on what happens in the courts, where if you are a registered voter, you're automatically mailed a ballot. You don't have to request your ballot. But by and large, when it comes to mail-in voting, the first thing you have to do is once you're registered, then you go to the appropriate site, which you can find on vote411.org, or you can go to your Secretary of State's site, if that's what you choose in your state, and find out how you request the ballot. Now, the majority of folks who, I shouldn't say the majority, there are multiple states who you don't have to have an excuse. You want to vote by absentee or by mail-in, you just request the ballot, they send you the ballot, you vote, and you mail it back, which is another piece. However, there are some states still where you have to have an excuse. And the excuse may be, I'm going to be out of town, or whatever the excuse may be that you have to have an excuse for voting. The only way you know that is to go to your state site. Like I said, once again, you can get through Vote 411 or go to the Secretary of State site in your state and find out if you are required to have an excuse to get an early ballot. Okay, so that's the first thing. So you find out that you can have an early ballot, you send in the request for the ballot, and they get that, and then they send the ballot to you. Okay, and that's when you start your voting piece. Does that make sense? Did I miss anything there?
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm just going to recap that every state is different. You need to go to vote411.org or your Secretary of State's site and click on your state and figure out what your rules are. It'll take you to figure out how to request your absentee ballot.
Right.
Some states don't require a reason. Some states require a reason. Many states have COVID-19 as a reason, but you need to, in most states, not going to show up on your door just because it shows up. You are going to have to ask for it. So if you're thinking you need to mail it in, ask for it. So a question for you, if I ask for a mail-in ballot and it shows up, do I have to use it or can I go vote and not use it?
Yes. Okay. So that's a good question too. And once again, every state has a rule. Generally speaking, and I hate to be general, but if you get a mail-in ballot and you opt not to mail it in, like you decide, oh, I want to go to the polls anyway. So the day that you show up at the polls, you have to bring that ballot with you. Okay. And the reason for that is because, contrary to popular belief, these ballots are tracked very well. So when you go to the polls and you get ready to vote, your the voter lists are going to show that you received a mail-in ballot. Okay. And so you should bring that ballot with you. Now, different polls, different states have different rules. A lot of people can just show up the day of voting, bring their ballot, drop their ballot in the box and go, and that's all they have to do. They can drop it in on the day of voting, long as it's received by X number of hours before, voting. Usually it's by the end of the day on voting, but once again, each state has rules. So if you get the ballot and you opt to change, then if you're going to go to the polling site, you need to make absolutely sure that you take that ballot with you. That's the one key thing that's pretty standard across the country. Okay.
Okay. And let's say I've got my ballot, and every state is different about what it means. Is there any special hocus pocus I have to do to my ballot other than fill it in? Do I have to go get my mom to sign off, or what's the story on my ballot?
It's very interesting. We've been in the courts and won a few wins, and there's still a couple out there there are some votes that have required, some states that have required that you have you have a witness to the signing of your ballot. But because of COVID, Many of those states have dropped that, and we're hopefully that will move into the future. But once again, that's a rule that you have to check. And if you have to have a witness, it will tell you there that you need to have a witness, just so you know. Okay. But you also need to follow the rules very carefully. I don't know if anybody's seen the articles just recently on ballots, that thing called naked ballots. Okay. Think, how can a ballot be naked? Well, the majority of mail-in voters ballots have two envelopes. They have a privacy envelope, and then they have the mailing envelope. And so what you do is you do your ballot, you put it in the privacy envelope and seal it, and then you put your ballot into the mailing envelope. And the reason to do that is supposedly that is basically so that whoever is eventually opening, the envelope and putting setting up the ballot to be counted cannot tell how you voted, and so it's a privacy thing. The interesting thing about that is you can tell anybody you want how you voted, but somebody who you don't want to know doesn't have the right to know how you voted. Understand that? So it's really clear. And every time you get a mail-in ballot, there will be very distinct instructions. They're very clear. They come with every ballot, and you just follow them step by step. And if you really follow them step by step, you're going to be okay. So follow the steps. Okay.
Okay. So my ballot, I filled it out properly. I've put it in the envelope. How do I send it in? Do I send it in as soon as I get it? Is there a window of time? Because I'm hearing all this stuff saying it has to be postmarked by this date. No, it has to be received by this date. I mean, obviously the easiest thing is drop it in the mail as soon as you get it. But if you're not that type of a person,
yes, right. So once again, we come back to this: know your information, do your research. Okay, there are many states where, long as that ballot is received by close of voting on November 3rd, you'll be okay. There are other states where those rules are a little squishier, so that my recommendation, and the recommendation that the league makes, is that once you get that ballot and you filled it out, mail it as soon as you can, or drop it into, there are many states now and areas that have drop boxes for ballots, so you don't have to have a stamp. You just drop it into the box, and it looks a lot like a post office box, but it's marked that says this is a ballot box. And there's another reason to do that, though, to vote as early as possible, because as we've seen, there are going to be a lot more mail-in ballots this year than there ever were prior to 2020. A lot of it due around COVID, and a lot of it people acknowledging that this is a relatively easier way to vote for many people. Not all, but for some. And so you want to get that ballot in so it's ready to be counted, and it may help to decrease the confusion. Well, not the confusion, I don't want to say that, correct me there. It just makes it a lot easier if they have the ballots in and they're starting to handle the ballots. If they're all there, it's a lot easier than getting them all in on the very last moment before the polls close. So get it in soon. And also, if you get it in, you can track it. Every state that has mail-in ballots now has a spot where you can track and see if, one, your registration, if you can check to see if you're registered, you can also track to see if your ballot has been received. So that's also kind of a nice thing to know. So voting early, you're able to track it and know that your ballot is there.
Excellent. So I'm going to move to a different type of voting, early voting, because I know I live in New York State and we have early voting starting in a week or two. I plan on going early. Is it different from voting day of? Do I do the same kind of thing I do day of, or do I have to ask? What are the rules around early voting?
Once early voting is available, you can vote early. You don't have to have excuses. So that means, like, rather than going to the polls on the day of the poll, okay, you can go to the polls several days early, whenever, like you said, New York starts in a week, you said. So it makes it a lot more convenient for you. There may not be as many polling sites. That's the key. Some states you can only vote early at your, Secretary of State's or your voting election, your state or community election office. Everybody has a different spot, your auditor's office, where it may be, or you may have libraries set up or several different sites. You are not going to have as many early voting sites as you will voting sites on election day. So you have to be a little bit more aware of where the sites are. But you go in, sign in just like you do for a regular voting day. You get your ballot, you sign your ballot, and you cast it.
Okay, so I just have to hop onto my Secretary of State site or my town site and figure out where my early voting sites are and the dates,
Right.
because they vary.
And those things are also updated in vote411.org. Okay.
This is the place to go,
Mhm.
411.org. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the day of election, November 3rd, and you go to vote. Is it safe? What's going on with the elections? Do you have any knowledge of what that means when I show up at the polling booth on November 3rd? Yeah.
I guess, we have to say this, we can never guarantee 100% everything will always be safe. But at this point, we really want to emphasize that our elections are secure and there will be safety around voting. Almost every state has rules about how close, electioneers or whoever, even if it's protesters, can be to the polling sites. And so, there are boundaries. Okay. So you shouldn't be afraid to vote. You should just be wise. It's just like when you walk down the street anytime, you're aware of your surroundings. So you should be aware of your surroundings like you do every day. What I suggest and what we're starting to push is that the one thing about voting should be a happy thing. Okay. It should be a celebration that you have the opportunity to live in a country where you can go cast your vote. So what do you do when you want to celebrate or have a good time? You take somebody with you or you go with somebody. So I really encourage you to not only go vote, obviously, and if you choose to vote on the day of voting, but take somebody with you. We used to have a saying several years ago, go and vote and take a friend. I've heard states now are going to go buddy up and vote. Okay. So that take someone, because if there are going to be long lines, then you have someone to talk to. Okay. If they're going to be a wait, take a snack. There's no law that says you can't eat in a voting line. Okay. So take a bottle of water, whatever it takes, but take
Do
somebody.
not take a bottle of wine. There probably is a rule against that.
Yeah, not wine, water. Okay. Soda works also. But the key becomes that make it easy, make it fun, and share it with somebody. And this is your way also to get one of your friends to vote who may have been reluctant. So that's another good way to get people to vote.
So I'm looking at pull questions from the Q&A and from the email. So if people have questions, please put it in the Q&A section. We will try to get to it. While I wait for those, I'm going to hit a couple of the ones I got. I think it's important to hit what's appropriate behavior, apparel, and such at the polls. And I know it's not like, oh, what do I wear? There are things you cannot wear when you go to the polls. So let's talk about what it means.
Right. So what it means, basically, voting and voting sites are supposed to be non-political. Okay. So you shouldn't be wearing things to the polls that either, express, who your candidate is or what your party is, those kind of things. Just wear everyday, non-committal, just easy, comfortable clothing. I mean, I guess if you're at work and you're coming and you happen to be in your, whatever you may work in, if you work in a business and you're in a suit, you can come. If you work in a gym and you're in your sweats, you can come. Okay. But it should be non-political. The activity, you should not be trying to discuss politics with folks. Should not be trying to convince people who they should vote for. Electioneering is not allowed in polling places. It's as simple as that. So you're there purely to cast what your ballot is in a private ballot, and that's what it should be. And also you should respect the people around you. Okay. And anytime you're out in public, the thought should be, how do I respect the people around me? So the things like social distancing is going to be huge this year. Okay. So remember that. And, engaging with each other in a, fun but polite way. Disruptive behavior is unacceptable. And that may be something that, may cause you difficulty. So just remember, we all know how to respect each other and be polite, although one would wonder nowadays, but that's what you should do. Voting is fun stuff, but it's also serious stuff.
Excellent. So I'm getting some of the questions I saw come in on my email. what's a poll watcher? Because we all watch the debate and we're like, does that just somebody who's standing around and watching the poll? Can I be a poll watcher? What is the poll watcher?
Okay, so once again, we come back to this state issue that different states have different rules around poll watchers. Generally speaking, poll watchers in the past used to be primary like organizations or parties who wanted to see who is voting, okay? And so that they can check and see, oh, Mary Jane hasn't been here to vote yet. So they are watching the polls, see if they showed up, and then they can call them, say, are you going to come out to vote? Okay. And so that's what's the purpose of poll watchers in the past. And still that is the purpose of poll watchers now. Okay. But everybody, you can't just walk up and say, I want to come in here and watch the polls today. There are rules about who can be poll watchers, how many poll watchers they can be, what organizations can have, poll watchers. So once again, go to your sites, find out the rules around the poll watchers at your event. And the whole, at your voting site. And the whole concept we're hearing about, there'll be lots of people that are out there walking around, watching and looking how you vote. No, that's not how it works. You don't allow just a mass of people in to watch the polls in the polling site. Okay. There may be people on the outside of the barriers who claim to be poll watchers, but that's not who a poll watcher really is. Okay.
Okay. That's just somebody watching. All right.
Yeah, that's right.
So, because that was a little confusing to a lot of folks. Also, another point of confusion coming is you hear this question about Supreme Court, and I'm counting on the court, but that's not how elections are ratified. They're ratified on a state level. So maybe we want to make a comment about the Electoral College and how an presidential election is counted in this country.
Right. So once your state has voted and the state has figured out who won the election, basically, okay, then there is the next step to call that therefore they send their electors. That's the Electoral College, which is determined by how many representatives you have in college plus in Congress, plus your 2 senators. That's your number of electoral votes for your state. Those folks then cast the ballot for the president on the day, and I forget, all of a sudden I spaced the date, December, I think it's 8th or 14th, I apologize, I all of a sudden spaced the date out, okay? But there's a day in December when they finally cast that vote, okay? The rules around that have in the past been that if your state voted for, Governor Jones and Governor, Floor lost, that your Electoral College votes go to Governor Jones because the majority of people in your state wanted it that way. And that's the way it's pretty much been for a long time. There are 2 states in the nation who split their Electoral College. So they divide it by, if a third of the state votes one way and 2/3 the other way, they give a third of the electors to one candidate and the 2/3 to the other candidate, okay? The state I live in right now happens to be that way. That's Nebraska. We split our Electoral College. But anyway, so those are the folks who spread basically make the final vote. And that's why it becomes really critical when they talk about the Electoral College and is it time to change that or what does that mean? It's because of the Electoral College, what happens is that sometimes smaller states with a smaller population can have almost as much influence overall as larger states. So if you can amass enough smaller states, you can win because you get their electoral votes. So that's how the Electoral College can sway a vote. It's very important, and you're probably going to see some changes around that coming in the future too, but that's to be determined.
So I want to take a moment before we wrap up a bit here to talk a little bit about, and this is coming in from a QA. Now, 19th Amendment didn't mean everyone got the right to vote. They didn't. Native American women did not get it for several years. The Chinese population, I don't think it was 1960 something or 1940 something because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So there's still people who can't vote. And I want to talk about what that means, and are there things that we should be doing, and if people out and listening want to get involved and helping people access it, but what are some things that are on people's minds that we could be doing?
Well, first of all, that's absolutely right about the 19th Amendment didn't give everybody the right to vote. Let's put it this way, the 19th Amendment did not necessarily deny people to vote. What happened was citizenship had been denied to several groups within the country, and therefore they didn't even have the opportunity to register to vote, okay? And then when the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, those were in the years of Jim Crow, okay? So states who basically really run elections and make election laws had many things in place, like they had basically poll tax and various things like that that stopped people from voting. There used to be the one that most amazed me, like they'd set a jar of jelly beans on the table, and the voter would come in and they'd say to the African-American voter, for example, how many jelly beans are in this jar? And if they couldn't guess the correct number of jelly beans, well, then they couldn't vote. Well, clearly, I mean, how are they to know how many jelly beans were in the jar? And certainly they weren't going to be told even if they guessed the right number. And so, I mean, that literally was one of the things. I mean, there's just amazing the things that were used. However, what happened was, therefore, in 1965, we passed the Voting Rights Act, which basically gave the right to vote to everybody in this country, including our indigenous citizens and the other groups that had been denied in the past. Unfortunately, in 2013, the part of that act that kept states from doing many ways of voter suppression, like the strict voter ID laws you have now, was gutted by the Supreme Court. And therefore, what we call pre-clearance, that means that states couldn't change the laws around voting unless they were cleared by the courts first. That was taken out of the Voting Rights Act because people believed that discrimination in voting had gone away. And so now we're back to the point where we are facing those problems. But currently, so there are people currently who are still not, and probably the biggest population for you to think about who does not have the right to vote are returning citizens, or citizens who have been incarcerated for felonies. They have spent their time and they're ready to return into the public and get back their citizenship, because it's taken away. The right to vote is taken away once they are incarcerated in almost all states. And there are many barriers to them getting back into the voting population. And so that's probably one of the biggest groups right now that is disenfranchised. And as we all know, that weighs heavily on people of color and people of lesser financial means.
Excellent. So we've come upon the 8 o'clock hour, and there's still so many things I'd love to discuss, but I promised we'd wrap. So I want to take a moment, first of all, to thank Dr. Turner for giving us this incredibly informative session and helping us out. It's a super important year, and the information is invaluable. So thank you, Dr. Turner.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being here. And remember, your voice is your vote.
Yes. And to everybody online, I'd like you to be aware of a few things that are coming up. You'll get an email with the websites that we've been discussing. You'll be able to use them. Please visit the League of Women Voters or the National Women's Hall of Fame also. National Women's Hall of Fame is now open, and you can make an appointment, come and see our museum. Also, look forward to our next event. Our next event will be in December, and we are doing a virtual induction honoring people, minorities and people of color who have passed, who were not honored earlier. So we are really excited about this upcoming programming and hope you can join us. Thank you to all of our attendees. Thank you to the League of Women Voters, and thank you, Dr. Turner.
Thank you. Have a wonderful evening and wear a mask.
Stay well.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. Natalie, you there?
Yep. Hi, Suj, I'm here.